Hey, how you doing? It's Clayton here from howtodrawcomics.net. In today's video, I'm going to be showing you the process for a commission that I did for Tin Man Games. And this character specifically is called Oriana, and she is from a video game called The Warlock of Firetop Mountain. I'll post a link to that game in the description below this video so that you can check it out. Tin Man Games was really a great company to work for because even though they were a video game company at the core, they gave me a lot of comic book artwork because the kind of video games that they created were kind of like these interactive video game books, like the Choose Your Own Adventure books that you might have gotten out at the library back in the day. And the first project that I worked on with them was really, really fun. It was actually, it was called Fear, I believe, Project Fear or something like that. I forget the exact name of it. But essentially, it was based on a traditional game book that you would actually hold in your hands and read, and it was turned into an actual interactive video game. And it was all centered around superheroes. And for this particular project, I was able to draw up a bunch of comic book characters, and those comic book characters each had various body types and head types that you could pick from, and it was really, really fun. Actually, I just remembered it. It was called Appointment with Fear. And yeah, it was super, super awesome. I'll post a link to that in the description below because it was a super fun game, and Tin Man Games did really, really well producing it, and it was a lot of fun to work on. So then, of course, they asked me back to work on the Warlock of Firetop Mountain. I did up a bunch of different avatars for that game and a few illustrations as well, which is what you're seeing me create here for Oriana, who I believe was kind of like the main villain of this particular story. Now, initially, for this illustration, I'd created a version of Oriana that I sent off to Neil, who heads Tin Man Games, and he wasn't 100% happy with it just because she didn't look evil enough. She was a little bit too beautiful. So I went back to the drawing board and I re-sketched her up to create a character who looked like this, a little bit more evil and, like not trustworthy whatsoever. Like any deal you strike with this character, you're going to be the one to lose out. So yeah, that was a really fun challenge because it meant that I was able to kind of get into the psychological aspects of the character and how the audience might relate with her. So what is her impact going to be on the viewer? How is she going to make the viewer feel? And I think that this is a kind of understated importance that we forget to incorporate into our comic book art, especially a lot of the time, is how do you present your characters within your comic book in a way that really causes the viewer to have this emotional reaction to them and to be able to relate with them on that level. I think that it's important because it increases the engagement of what you're showing to the viewer and the viewer themselves. You know, that connection that they have to the work that you're showing them. And that really helps them to get into the story, to connect and be part of the world that you're presenting to them. Without that connection, what I've found happens is the viewer just puts down the book or the video game that they're playing and they become disconnected. You know, that suspense of disbelief just isn't there anymore. And really our main goal when it comes to creating a comic book, a video game or a movie, our main goal is to draw the viewer into that world, to make them forget about reality for just a little while and really suck them into this story that we've created for them, and to really make them feel like they're a part of that story, that they're a participant within it. So back to Oriana specifically here, you can see that I've started out with a really rough sketch, and this is pretty much how all of my comic book illustrations start out, all of my concept designs, essentially everything that I set out to create. It all begins here with a very basic, rough-looking draft that doesn't look very pretty, that, needs a lot more refinement before it could be called done. But the reason that I start out so rough and kind of begin working at a distance is because I really want to give myself the freedom to explore the composition and the design that I'm going to come up with. And if I was too tight in the beginning, I wouldn't feel like I was able to have that level of exploration available to me. It'd almost be as if I was married to the initial idea that I came up with, and thus wouldn't be able to go outside the boundaries and explore beyond that idea. So when I can keep it rough, it makes it very easy for me to be willing enough to experiment, to have enough leeway there to expand upon the different ideas that I might be trialing in the initial phases of the drawing. And then when I hit upon something that I'm happy with, that I think is going to work, then I can go ahead into the refinement phase, which is what you're seeing happen on the screen in front of you right now as we enter into the inking. In order to do that, you can see here that I'm working in Manga Studio, aka Clip Studio Paint, which it is now known as. It used to be Manga Studio. For some reason, they changed their name and their branding, and it's now known as Clip Studio Paint. But the application is essentially the same. And what I'll do when I'm entering into the inking stage is I'll take the initial pencil draft, which is roughly scribbled up on the page, and I'll turn that to blue using the layer color function, which you can see over to the right hand side of the screen. There's a little blue square icon there, and if you click that, it'll turn whatever is on the layer that you have selected to this lighter blue, which has a more see-through opacity to it. What that does is it helps me to make a visual distinction between the penciled work and the inks, so that I can see what the final inks is going to look like a little bit easier. If I wasn't able to do that, then it'd kind of make the whole, whatever I'm looking at on the screen, a little bit more confusing to decipher. So thank goodness that they incorporated that into their application. It really works quite well. It also kind of, I guess, ties back to the traditional way of working for comic book artists, where once upon a time, when all comic book artists worked on pencil and paper, what you do is you would actually create the roughs for your penciled comic book page in this blue pencil, essentially, and then scan it into the computer. And what that would mean is that anything that was blue or drawn blue would, was it photocopied? I think they would do it up in blue pencil. They would go over the top of the blue pencil with the final inks straight over the top. And then when they photocopied it, none of that, the blue would come through, but the final inks would. I think that's the way it worked. I grew up in a time where we had a lot of digital technology available to us as artists. So I never really, for the majority of the time that I've been drawing, went the traditional route as far as the workflow was concerned. I kind of really got to know the digital tools that I had at my disposal and learn how to use them. And I just found that to be a more optimal process. It was a little bit easier on the expenses as well, because if you're working traditional, you've got to keep on refilling your pens with ink and keep on buying paper, pencils and erasers, because all of that stuff kind of, it gets ground down after illustration over time. And you got to keep on, repurchasing those supplies. Whereas when it comes to digital art and the digital ways of working that are out there, all you really have to do is purchase a tablet. And to be quite frank with you, I use a very basic, very cheap tablet that's quite old now, and it is Intuos 3 from Wacom. It's nothing fancy, I can assure you. It's not a Cintiq or anything like that, and it's got a fairly small drawing space on it as well. So you don't really need anything fancy to create what you're seeing here on the screen. It's really just getting to know the tools, becoming confident with them and comfortable in using them, and then doing your magic, essentially. So all you really need is a tablet, and then you buy the application, the software that you want to use. Can be, whatever you want, really, these days. It's super affordable. Manga Studio, which I'm using here, is just, it's one of the most affordable digital drawing applications out there right now. And then even Photoshop, although that used to be quite expensive, Adobe now offers a monthly subscription, which is fairly cheap. So even if you wanted to use it for, a one-off project, you could kind of, get a subscription for a shorter amount of time and not even have to pay anywhere near the amount that you'd have to have otherwise have paid for it outright if you wanted to purchase the application in full. So it's pretty cool. We live in a great time now, especially as artists, where we're able to kind of produce our work. I wouldn't say necessarily on the cheap, but for a significantly smaller amount of production cost than we would have incurred back in the day. So you can see there that I just kind of went back and reworked the design of Oriana's crown there. It's going to be a major central design piece within the illustration that kind of gives her that sense of dominance, at least for me. You think about kings and queens and that level of superiority and authority. I think that that's really what I'm trying to get to come through here within the illustration, especially for a character like this who is supposed to be intimidating, who is supposed to be kind of, really putting across her authority and making you feel submissive just as you look at her. And that's a great thing to try and incorporate into your villains as well. I love the psychological aspect of character design and being able to create a character that does cause you to feel a certain way and remember them in a certain way. And I think a memorable character, what makes a memorable character is their effectiveness at doing this. So yeah, that's something that I really wanted to focus on. And I know that, it was important to Neil as well. I think when you're combining comic book art or illustration in any capacity with video game design, you've got a very interactive medium there that you've got to work with. So you really want to try to push that as far as you possibly can to make the experience for the user at the end of the day, the video gamer, the audience, as immersive as possible. And it's really just good practice in any medium that you're working in. Even if it's just an illustrated pinup, if you can make that an immersive experience, a memorable experience, it's going to be that much better for you as an artist because people are going to be able to connect with it on a much greater level and a much more potent level. So figure out a way in which you can do that. For me, I guess because I was always interested in that aspect of my illustration, I was curious enough to look into it a little bit further and to ask myself these questions, like how can I make a compelling character that causes the audience to feel a certain way, and then depending on how I wanted the audience to feel based on a particular character, I would look into it a little bit further and I'd start to ask myself, I'd look at the movies that I was watching, for example, or the other comic book characters that are out there and the comic books that I read back in the day. And I'd ask myself, what do these characters have that are causing me to feel the way in which I'm feeling? And how can I take those aspects of those characters and incorporate them into my own? And that's kind of the way that I'd do it. I'd look at the examples that were already out there, and I would replicate what they had within them in my own artwork. And for the most part, I think it worked. And after a while of doing this repeatedly, I kind of got to know what worked and what didn't work. Really, all you need is eyes for this stuff, to be able to look at your character and to try to ask yourself as you're creating them how they're making you feel, even as the creator. It can be difficult to do this, of course, because since you're the creator, you're so close to your work that it's difficult to disconnect enough to look at it from that fresh perspective that your audience will be looking at it from. Our perspective is very skewed when we're the one behind the creation of the artwork that we're showing to the audience. They're going to be seeing it in a completely different way, which is why it's always good to have the perspective of an outside person to look at your artwork and to really give you their honest opinion. They don't have to be a talented artist at all. They can just be a normal person, could be a family member or a friend, and just ask them, hey, how does this character make you feel? In fact, it's better sometimes when they're not an artist, because then they can come at it from an even more genuine and honest perspective. They're not really judging it necessarily on the execution of the technique or anything like that. They're kind of just telling you how they feel based on their experience of the character. So I'm placing in a few details around Oriana's face. Now, she has a bit more of a mature look about her. So she has a little bit more rendering than I would usually add in around the face of a woman. This is perfect for older characters, older female characters, or female characters that you want to have come across as being a bit more gaunt. So, that's why I've added that additional rendering in there. If she was a younger character, I would have certainly left it out, or she, wasn't as gaunt. I definitely wouldn't have put in that additional detail, that additional rendering around the cheekbones. If you're not careful, that can actually cause your characters to look less feminine and more masculine, which is totally fine. If you want a female character who does come across as a bit more masculine, then you should totally go for that, because it's going to work well. You can mix and match the various aesthetics that you typically see on a stylized male character and female character, and, kind of bend the rules a little bit in that regard to come up with, say, a female character, for example, that does come across as, I wouldn't say manly, but definitely more masculine in that sense. It really depends on the character and their bio and what their background is, what their story is about, as far as how you're going to represent them on the page. But this is just something to keep in mind. I like to view all of these attributes as a scale, essentially, that you can dial back and forth in order to come up with something that does provoke a certain feeling. So that does cause them to come across in a certain way. So with the Oriana here, of course, being a character who is a little bit older, who's a little bit more gaunt, who's supposed to come across, I don't really know the story of the Warlock of Firetop Mountain. I'm sorry to say, it is quite interesting. Just the fact that I get commissioned to do these characters for, various comic books and video games, and unfortunately, I don't do as much of my research as I should before jumping into it. Usually I'll have a reference to work from, or a number of references to work from, and I'll kind of just go off that and hope, I cross my fingers and hope that I can come up with something that the client is going to be happy with. And usually, most of the time, they are happy. I send these commissions back and forth throughout the development of them, just so that I can make sure that I'm on the right track, and that's kind of how I gauge whether or not it's coming together in the way that the client is going to be happy with. So these bracelet elements that I'm adding in around her wrists were really fun to come up with, actually. And this was at a time within my artistic development where I was really starting to get into my production groove. So you'll notice that this was still at the point where I was sketching up a really, really rough draft in the penciling stage and then jumping straight into the inks and going over the top of that. None of the details that I'm adding in here with the inks were already established in the penciling stage. I'm kind of just adding them in on the fly here as I continue to develop the illustration and bring it through to a close. And being able to wing it in that way was something that I was always nervous about. I always felt like I needed to make sure that I'd penciled out every single little detail first before inking over the top of it. And I guess that's just the way that I was told and taught how to ink You'd traditionally get your refined pencils, or depending on the penciler, I guess it was at some level of refinement, and then you would be required to go over the top of it. But you would always need to kind of interpret the inks the pencils, regardless of how tight they were with the inks. Because if you didn't do that, then the inks themselves, that final line work, would lack a certain amount of character. So you as the inker kind of had to develop your own artistic skills to an extent, because it wasn't just a matter of tracing over the pencils that were there. You would have to interpret them and make sure that, they had a certain level of energy and gesture and rhythm within that final inked line art. And so I guess that came to me much more naturally later on when I decided to kind of skip the middleman, completely leave out the refined penciling stage and just add in the details and all the rendering and the refined line weights and whatnot in the final inks. And that's exactly what I'm doing here. You can see that I don't even have that underlying draft visible right now as I place in the rendering around her crown here. I'm just kind of just doing all that, and I'm going by pure instinct at the moment. I'm kind of interpreting where there might be form and leaving areas of for the eye to rest, and I'm kind of just adding it in on the fly here and seeing what works and what doesn't work. And I guess if something doesn't work, there's no hassle in just pulling out the eraser and starting again, which I will often do. I'm not afraid to do that whatsoever. I just kind of think it comes with the territory when you're a comic book artist. Adding in some drop shadows here to really get those details and to pop on the crown. And I'm changing the size of them up a little bit because the initial character design, which had already been established in the old version of the game book that this new one was based on, showed her crown as having slightly larger, I don't know what you'd call them. I'm just going to call them round crown details for now. But, I would kind of adjust this stuff on the fly as I worked, and it was no big deal. Now, I'm zoomed in at about 25% here to get the inks looking this sharp and this refined. And I'll only do this at the inking stage when I'm really starting to add in that detail, and only really if I have to. But I think that zooming into this point is a good place to have it, because if you zoom in too far, you'll find that you lose the ability to balance the details and the thickness of the lines within the composition of the overall illustration. It just won't be balanced. You need to be able to be zoomed out enough so that you can see how the overall illustration is coming together as a whole as you're developing it, as you're placing in that final line art. Because it very well may be the case that if you're working in too close, and most of us do this, by the way. I know that I did it in the beginning. We all fall for this mistake most of the time when we're starting out, where we zoom in just way, way, way too far. Because, when you look at these intricate details and the tiny little hatches that I'm placing in here to describe the forms of her crown, it looks so detailed that you would have to be zoomed in so far in order to place them in. But as you can see, it's not a matter of zooming in to get those details implemented. It's actually more to do with the size of the brush and the amount of pressure I'm applying as I ink this line work in. And the size of the brush is fairly small at this point, especially in comparison to the overall size of the illustration. And then the amount of pressure that I'm applying is very light. So that is what allows me to get that very fine line work, very subtle details placed in there without having to zoom in super, super far in order to implement them. So the number one piece of advice that I can give you, especially if you're just starting out, is try to resist the temptation to zoom right into your artwork, because again, that'll cause you to lose perspective on how the whole thing is coming together as a whole. So that's just a little bit of advice that I think will really help out a lot of beginners, because I see this come up all the time, and you can always tell because the way in which the values are composed within the illustration and the line work in relation to it as a whole just simply is unbalanced. And what I mean by unbalanced is it's just not reading clearly. The illustration is so congested with detail that it's hard to interpret. And so in order to avoid that, you want to make sure that you're at least over here to the right-hand side of the screen in the navigator menu. You're at least looking at that to make sure that even from a distance, you're able to make out what's going on. And if you can do that, what you'll find is that your illustrations become much more aesthetically pleasing to look at. People get what's going on. They don't have to scratch their head and wonder what it is you're trying to show them. So as I go around the illustration now, I'm kind of taking my time to place in the line weights and to get the details incorporated onto her fingers there. It's very easy for the details on hands to cause them to look a little bit creepy. Again, Oriana is somewhat of an evil villain, but you don't I'm not necessarily trying to have her hands look like evil old witch hands, so I'm trying to avoid that. And I'm zooming in and out a little bit here. Again, trying to make sure that everything is coming together from a distance, including the size of her head, which wasn't quite. I did have to go back and resize that a little bit. And going back in here and adding in those bracelets, you can see me trying to get those done as fast as possible. And that is one of the reasons that I went for the straight to inking approach right after I've sketched in a rough draft for the pencils, is that it just saved a lot more time. And especially when you're working for a client, I mean, time is of the essence. So you want to try to optimize your process as much as you possibly can, because if you can do that, what it'll mean is you're able to make more money in a shorter amount of time, and also deliver the work that you promised to deliver to the client in a timely manner, which they're always going to enjoy because they've got deadlines of their own to meet. And so the faster that you can get the work that they've employed you to do done for them, the better. They're going to come back to you again and again because they know that they can depend on you to get it done. And so I guess in regards to working with clients, it's always good to deliver on your promises. If you say you're going to have the work for them done at a certain amount of time, to a certain degree of quality, make sure that you deliver on that quality within the time frame that you've set for yourself, within the time frame that you've told them you're going to give it to them. So there's a lot of plait patterns that, or formations, I guess you could say, that I've added into this particular illustration around the hair, around the bracelets, and this is very detailed work. But the funny thing is with details is that although it looks like a lot of work, and it is, and it takes up a lot of time, I'm not going to lie, the cool thing about it is that it doesn't require a whole lot of thinking. A lot of the hard work is actually done in that initial drafting stage where you're laying in the foundations and plotting out the overall composition of the illustration. And so once that's done, really all it is I am still using my eye to make sure everything's balanced, of course. I'm strategically placing in this hatching and the rendering of the details in order to make sure that it's coming across in the correct way, that I'm interpreting what I'm trying to show on the page in a way which visually makes sense. Because, if I wasn't thinking about where I was placing this hatching, that I just wouldn't be able to do that. So it's always important to make sure that, what I'm trying to get at is to make sure that every single stroke that you place down onto the page has some kind of purpose, that there's a reason to have it there, that you're not just placing in detail for detail's sake. Because if you do that, it's not hard to render. Most of the time, the difficult aspect of rendering is knowing where to place it. Cross-hatching techniques are pretty simple to learn, but knowing how to balance that hatching in order to capture just the right level of tone and value in the correct areas to describe the form accurately, that's the difficult part. And it's something that I think after some time, you as an artist will develop an ability to be able to visually use your eyes to figure out exactly to what extent all of that applies. In even the tone of the elements themselves. Like, for example, the crown on Oriana's head is going to be of a different tone than the scarf around the front of her chest there and neck. So, I've got to figure out, well, if that's the case, how much rendering do I need to add into each one of those elements in order to take them down or up to the correct tone that they need to be at? Because we are only dealing with black and white line work at this point. So it's important for me to be able to figure that stuff out. So I'm going in now, I'm adding in some shadows around her neck there and around the bottom of the scarf, because I want to make sure that it looks three-dimensional, and drop shadows are excellent for being able to do that because they introduce that additional level of depth within the element that you're working on. Why? Because it describes the solidity of the form that you're working with. It tells the viewer on a subconscious level that the light which is hitting that particular object or that particular element is preventing the light from shining through, and that in fact it's casting a shadow because of it's not allowing that light to pass through, and it's casting that shadow onto another form underneath it, which also kind of provides an indication that the form underneath the form that's overlapping it is also solid, because of course the shadow is hitting its surface. So now I'm working on what would you call them? I guess they're not really pigtails. They're kind of plaited hair on either side of Oriana's face there. It's kind of framing it real nicely, actually. And there's some jewelry just around the bottom of that plait, which had a little bit of a design on it in the initial concept that I'm kind of interpreting now, because the initial concept wasn't super detailed. I think it was like one image of Oriana that I had to go off, and it was a fairly old image that was drawn in a much less detailed way than the way in which I'm interpreting her here. So I had to kind of make up a lot of the details that I'm adding in, while still at the same time capturing the essence of the character and making sure that was coming across in the right way, which, as I said before, it didn't initially happen. I sent this off to Neil, and he was like, Clayton, we need to make her look a little less beautiful than, because you know me, I like to draw beautiful characters, and it just goes to show that, really you want to try to diversify the characters that you create as much as possible in terms of their look, because characters come in all different shapes and sizes. They're not all idealized people. They're not all beautiful. They're not all tall and dark and handsome or sexy. So because they come in all different shapes and sizes, you want to be able to ensure that you're able to represent a large variety of different types of people in the comic art medium, or whatever medium of art that you're working within. So now I'm adding in another drop shadow around the base here of her shoulder and breastplate, which again gives it that additional level of solidity and kind of pops it up off the underlying forms that it's overlapping. And I like to add in the major shadows first and foremost before I start placing in the detail. You can see me outlining some more shadows around the breast there. And the details that I add in after this point are going to be describing the overall texture of the dress that she's going to be wearing. But that'll come in just a moment. So let's see what I'm going to be working on next. It was such a long time since I've seen this illustration and worked on it. It was probably a few years ago now, actually, that it came out, the video game itself. So, I was looking through my video library because I got a ton of videos that I've recorded in the past that just never saw the light of day for one reason or another. I also, had to make sure that I asked Neil if it was okay to show you guys the process behind this character, because, of course, he employed me to do the character in the first place, which means technically it's his. So there's always a little bit of gray area there when you're working with clients as to whether or not you can show the stuff that you create for them. I find it's always best to just ask for permission first. I think that for a lot of artists, they feel a certain level of inherent entitlement to the work that they create, which I totally get and understand, because you are creating it with your own hands. And in that sense, it's yours. But if you're creating it for a client, then they're buying the product from you. So it's a product, and they own it in one capacity or the other. It depends, of course, if they're actually licensing the character that you're drawing for them, or the artworks, and to what degree of ownership they have over it. And of course, you just negotiate that with the client. But I find it's just to take out any complication, it's just better to ask them whether or not you can kind of release it to your own audience after some time has passed. And enough time had passed, I gotta say, for me to approach Neil and just say, and of course he said, yeah, no worries, please do. So Oriana has this kind of interesting pattern around her shoulder and breastplate there. And so I'm kind of, again, interpreting that design in my own way, somewhat reinventing it to an extent, and trying to give it a sense of three-dimensionality as I pop out the subtle patterns within the breastplate and the shoulder pads there. So I'm not really sure exactly what it's supposed to be, but it's part of her design, and I wanted to give a sense of form to these patterns here, because form looks cool on the page. It kind of prevents your artwork from looking super flat, which these little patterns would otherwise have been if I didn't add in those drop shadows and the subtle rendering around those shapes that you can see me placing in now. So all of this stuff, it requires time, an investment of time, that if you want to lift your artwork to that next level of quality and visual appeal, you'll have to invest. And so it's really up to you as the artist and the kind of style that you have. I think that some artists intentionally kind of develop a simplistic style that they know they can use to execute an artwork in a timely manner that, is a little bit more speedy. I got to say that the amount of detail that I incorporate into my artwork does cause me to spend a little bit more time on it than maybe some other artists would. But with experience and, mileage, you can get good at creating detailed artwork that you're ultimately able to get done in a faster amount of time anyway, because all of this stuff is just practice. And actually, these details that I'm dropping in here, I'm not thinking about them too much. I'm kind of having fun with it. And hey, if you put details into your work before and you're used to doing that, you know how fun they can be. So I'm really not I'm not too concerned necessarily with the amount of time it is taking me. It is taking me a little bit more time than it would have otherwise have taken me if I just left them out in the first place. But, I think it's always worth it in the end, because the end result, the final illustration that people are going to see is why create it if you don't want it to have some level of impact? Why create it in the first place? You want to show something to other people. You're not creating it for nothing. So the way I see it is, hey, every single illustration I'm going to create, I want it to have as much visual impact as I can possibly give it. So now I'm adding in the textured details to Oriana's outfit. And this is super interesting because I had no idea how I was going to approach this. It is essentially rendering, but it's rendering in a way that presents texture, the texture of the dress, and also kind of shades it at the same time. And the way in which that works is you'll notice that the areas of the form, looking at her arm here, the areas of the form that are facing away from the light and transitioning into shadow, that there's a significantly greater amount of texture detail within that area. Well, as the form turns toward the light, that kind of gradates off, and more so, that detail begins to diminish until in the lightest parts of the form, there's barely any texture there whatsoever. And that creates the illusion of light hitting the form and shading it, essentially, creating light areas of the form where the light is at its most intense, and suggesting dark areas of the form where there's barely any light catching it at all. And it's just really a matter of value, lighter value and darker value. The more detail you add into a certain part of that form, the darker that value is going to become. So that's kind of the way in which I'm gauging where the detail goes. Because, as I was saying before, it's easy to add in this detail, but where you add it in is the question. And so you have to have some rules there in place, some kind of strategy to tell you where exactly to place those details. And so I just asked myself, well, where is the shadow going to be at its most intense? Where are the highlights going to be across the form? And I use that to scale the detail that I'm going to place in around it. So now we're working in around the base of the breast there, and I'm trying to add in enough detail between the transition of light and dark that the roundness of the form is properly presented. Because that's the other thing as well, like the amount of fall off, the softness of the gradient between the light and dark values is going to suggest the roundness of the form, the hardness of the transition as the light casts across it. So there's a lot of things at play here, a lot of little calculations that I'm doing inside my mind as I place in the rendering and the details for this illustration. And it takes practice in order to do that on a more automatic level. Man, I can't even imagine how it would have been for me in the beginning. I think that it's something that as an artist, you have an inkling toward. Like you kind of have a clue as to how and where to place the detail in a way that gets the form's reading. And I believe that we're all born with that natural intuition because we all have eyes, and that's kind of the way in which our eyes interpret what we see. Like this stuff translates to reality because what we're suggesting on the page is supposed to somewhat be a depiction of what we would see in reality. So we're kind of manufacturing the work in a way that causes the eyes, as they look at our artwork, to interpret it as form, as shadow, as highlights, as details and texture. So we're kind of applying this. What we've done is we've taken what we see in reality, we've tried to formulate certain rules around it and interpret it as, again, light and form. And then we've taken that interpretation and attempted to replicate it on the page. So that's kind of why, again, I believe that we all have a natural intuition at being able to do this. Even if no one taught you this stuff at all, you'd still kind of have an idea as to what you're supposed to do, and you could figure it out in your own. So I'm adding in a little bit of a pattern to the back of her scarf there. I guess it must be, looking at it, it must be connected to the chest and breastplate because it has a similar pattern on it. Adding in some line weights to really get those patterns to pop. Rendering around the base, the underside of the cloth there. Again, really trying to describe the formation of the cloth as it folds up and kind of curves into that cradle-like formation. Then I'm adding in some more details around the hair and line weights as well, just to really get them to pop off against all that other detail. Really trying to add some texture in. When you've got an illustration that is this detailed, it can be easy to get lost within it. So you have to emphasize the key elements, such as the bracelet here that I'm adding line weights and rendering around. Because otherwise, when they're sitting right against all that texturing that I've placed into the dress itself, it's hard to create a visual separation between them without that emphasis around the key contours. So I try to make sure that I make it as obvious as possible as to where each element ends and the next element begins, to really suggest the overlap that is present in relation to each of the elements. Again, you've got a couple overlapping elements here that we're looking at just in Oriana's costume alone. We've got her head that overlaps her neck, and then the scarf that overlaps that, and then the shoulder and chest plate, and then you've got the dress underneath all of it. So all of that overlap needs to be suggested. Now, Oriana is going to be sitting at an old wooden table here, so the biggest focus for me is going to be at this point representing the texture, the wood texture within that table. And because we're looking at a face of the table here, which is cast away from the light, so there's not as much light, at least, hitting it as there is the top of the table, we're going to add an increased amount of rendering here to really make sure that we've got the indication of a darker value, a darker tone, to show that that face is in shadow. And by face, I mean the face of the particular form, the object that we're dealing with on a simplified level. When I think about the table here, I'm not thinking about really all the intricate details necessarily in order to place them in. I'm thinking about the table as a block formation as a whole. It's essentially a squashed rectangular prism, I should say. I very much like to avoid using two-dimensional terms for 3D shapes. I wouldn't call a sphere a circle if I could help it. And now what I'm trying to do as I place in the details on the top of the table is what I really want to try to do is create a light spot right in the middle there, where she's leaning over the top. And I just think that that's going to kind of, help frame her a little bit, and it's going to add to the composition in a way which is a bit more pleasing and helps it overall to read better. Okay, so again, those details, you can see that I added them in quite fast, even though there's a ton of them there. So, and again, I wasn't really sure how I was going to approach this table, in the same way I wasn't sure how I was going to approach the texture of her dress either. So when I was on the fly here, I didn't have a whole lot of time to think about it because I had to get this commission to Neil. You know, he wanted it done at a particular time. They were working on a video game, and this was actually an intro scene to the video game because I think this character gives the player their mission to an extent, which is why I'm not quite sure on her exact role within the video game. But, you know, it was needed. It was an integral part of the video game that I had to get to the client. So when it comes to things like the table and the textures on the dress and now the flames in the background that I'm about to add in, I've got to try and figure out a way in which I'm going to approach that, even if I don't do it a whole lot of the time. And to be honest, I don't think I'd ever really drawn or inked comic book styled fire up until this point. So I had a few references there. There were some references from Mark Silvestri that I was following, and I would often look at other comic book artists and the way in which they approached certain elements such as fire and, you know, wooden texture and whatnot. And I would try to kind of implement that into my own illustrations in my own way, and that would kind of help. But still, it's kind of nerve-wracking because you're just sitting there and praying that it turns out well at that point, because the confidence isn't there. It can't be there if you've never done it before. So it's just a process where you got to hope for the best, and if worse comes to worse, I guess redo it. But the thing with, you know, more organic textures and elements such as fire is that it doesn't really need to look a specific way. You know, a face is important to get right. It has particular proportions that need to be adhered to, facial feature placement and shape that needs to be incorporated in order for it to look accurate. But when it comes to, a fiery flame like the one you're seeing me ink up here, because it's just so dynamic in its nature and can take on essentially any form, it doesn't necessarily adhere to a particular set of rules that at least anyone could look at and say, hey, that looks wrong, because it's just constantly in motion. It's just constantly changing. It's essentially a gestural line on a page that could be placed down in any way and still look fairly accurate. So then what it becomes is a case of, okay, well, if the shape of the flame can look any way and it can be composed in any way, how do we place in the correct level of value and tone in order for it to actually look like fire? Because that's the final component that's really going to make or break the interpretation of fire that I'm trying to create here. So I'm kind of adding that in, and again, I'm hoping for the best. You know, really, I think that when it comes to something like fire, what you're going to find is a lot of the end product, the final product, and how that's going to look will be determined within the coloring stage, which I'm going to go over next week. So we're going to continue on with this illustration after we've inked it up in a moment here, and take it through to completion. But make sure that you join me back here next week on the How to Draw Comics channel, and we'll bring this illustration through to the end, and I'll show you how it all turns out. I really want to try to do up these illustrations in a series of videos, because I think that, this is an hour long as it is, and who wants to sit down for more than that amount of time watching a drawing demonstration? It can be difficult to get through, even if you are super committed to this stuff, especially these days where there's so many other things biting for our attention. So, and it also, I want to try to have some level of interest continually within the drawing demonstrations that I'm putting out for you. And so I figure that, hey, if I can make some of these at least into a series that has a certain level of continuation, it'd be great. It'll be great. It'll kind of space the content out a little bit, and it'll give you something to look forward to. So now I'm adding in just some pitch black there into the back of the flames. And I'm really hoping that the shape of the flames overall is going to frame Oriana in an aesthetically pleasing way that represents her in the sort of feeling and the kind of gives off the kind of mood that I'm trying to manufacture here on the page. Because again, every element that you're seeing me place in, it's playing into a certain narrative. And the way in which you interpret Oriana really is going to be dependent on my ability to craft the illustration in such a way and to present it in such a way that the way I want it to come across links up with and is consistent with the way that you're interpreting it. Because for all I know, if I haven't done this accurately, you could be interpreting it in a completely different way to what I'm intending. So that's kind of the difficult part, right? Is to synchronize my interpretation of the illustration with your interpretation of the illustration. And so that's the thing that I'm constantly trying to figure out is how do I get better at doing that? How do I speak your visual language so that we're both on the same page? So now I'm going in and you can see that the shape of the flame here is fairly like clean cut. So I'm trying to go around the outside of it and almost not necessarily blend it in to the background there, but just try to make it a little bit more organic, a little bit more flame-like. Because, when you look at a flame, it's not like a cutout shape. It's, there's sparks flying off of it. The flames are, licking the outside edges. And so I'm really trying to get that to come across and to create that fiery sense or that fiery visual, I guess. It wouldn't really be a sense, but, just a fiery look for the background here. So again, I'm adding in those sparks and I'm trying to make it look flame-like. Trying to ask myself, well, how do flames actually behave and what is the visual interpretation of that going to look like? Adding in a bit more rendering around the base there. Again, really just trying to give the flame form, but the form of a flame isn't going to be represented in the way that you would interpret the form of, say an arm or a leg or another bit of the anatomy, right? It's a different element altogether. It's made up of different materials. So, and that's essentially what it is. It's a material. So there's going to be different values required there that you have to incorporate in order to present it accurately. So I'm zooming out here, again, really trying to get an overall look at the illustration and how the composition is coming together. And that just helps me to figure out, well, hey, I'm going to need more flames here, and I'm going to need a little bit more rendering there. And yeah, getting that zoomed out perspective so that you can see how it's coming together as a whole is just so important. Always try to make sure that you do that as much as you possibly can. And what you'll find is that there'll be less room for error within your illustrations. You won't zoom out and realize, oh damn, like this entire illustration is just flawed. And it can often be a surprise. It can come as a shock to us sometimes. We've been working for hours on this illustration, zoomed in, detailing it out, and then zoom out, and it doesn't, work out the way or look the way that we intended it to look. But that just about wraps up our demonstration here of Oriana. I hope that you've enjoyed this video and that you've got a ton of value out of it. I really enjoyed putting it together for you. Again, next week, what we'll do is we'll go over the coloring process for Oriana, and I'll show you exactly how I went about that. It's also going to be super fun, and I can't wait for you to check it out. If you'd like more comic art tips, tricks, and tutorials, be sure to check out our website, www.howtodrawcomics.net. You'll find a bunch of really useful resources over there, including, again, written tutorials, videos, courses, and we've even got a podcast as well. So we're really trying to put out as much value for our fellow aspiring comic book artists as we possibly can on there. Thanks a lot for watching. Until next time, keep on creating, keep on practicing, and I'll catch you in the next video.